9/11 was no doubt one of the most devastating events in history, claiming the lives of almost 3,000 victims, permanently damaging the lives of their families and friends. This incident has single-handedly changed the course of history, fueling the war on terror, costing the US trillions of dollars and ushering in a new era of security and fear against Muslims. But what if the US was somehow able to anticipate these attacks and stop them? What if one of the most pivotal moments in history never took place? What if 9/11 never happened? First of all, as you guys probably already know, September 11th wasn't the first time terrorist groups have tried to take down the Twin Towers. In 1993, a terrorist group placed a truck bomb in the North Tower of the World Trade Center. The plan was to destabilize the North Tower and send it crashing into the South Tower, killing thousands of people. Fortunately, the plan failed, but the danger was real as it killed 6 people and injured over 1,000. What's even scarier is that some experts claim that if the bomb was placed closer to the foundation of the building, it may have very well worked. So clearly, terrorist groups had their eyes on the World Trade Center for a while, and as sad as it is, if 9/11 didn't take place, they probably would have continued to plot other ways to take down the building. But as for the effects of 9/11, I think these effects may be grouped into 4 major groups: political, economic, social, and global. Starting with political repercussions, President Bush wouldn't have launched the war on terror the following day, initiating attacks in Afghanistan and Iraq. 27 months later, on December 13, 2003, Saddam Hussein may have not been captured, and we may see a policy of containment of the Hussein regime similar to North Korea today. At the same time, this overthrow may have still occurred as the fear of Iraq building weapons of mass destruction were at an all-time high at the time. But anyways, while it is still very controversial whether or not Hussein's capture was good for Iraq or not, this was definitely a victory for the US in the war on terror as claimed by President Bush. Furthermore, this swift action after 9/11 established him as a leader and instilled a sense of security among US citizens. Without this victory in Iraq, Bush would have had a very tough time winning the 2004 election, as he won by a very narrow margin even with this. Just a single swing state like Florida going over to the Democratic Party would have led to a Democratic victory for John Kerry, so without 9/11, President Bush would have probably not been re-elected. On top of this, considering that this election would have been more focused on the economy rather than controlling extremism, John Kerry may have not been the Democratic nominee either, as his Vietnam War background wouldn't have helped him secure the nomination. Remember his famous quote, "I'm John Kerry and I'm reporting for duty."
I'm John Kerry and I'm reporting for duty.
Anyways, following this in the 2008 election, we probably would have seen John Kerry or the winning Democrat secure the nomination once again. So Obama would have remained the senator from Illinois. There wouldn't have been an African American president and no birth controversy either. And as for the election itself, we wouldn't have seen such a landslide victory for the Democrats. Following that, considering 2 consecutive Democratic presidents, the 2008 economic recession, and the fact that Osama bin Laden, the most wanted terrorist in the world, wouldn't have been killed by a Democratic president, we may have very well seen Mitt Romney win the 2012 election. Following this, Donald Trump wouldn't have entered the 2016 election as he wouldn't have a chance against Mitt Romney running for re-election. So unless Donald Trump went for the Democratic nomination, we wouldn't see Donald Trump in the political landscape at all. Moving back, we wouldn't have seen the passage of a slew of laws and regulations inspired by 9/11. From the Aviation and Transportation Security Act leading to the TSA to the creation of the US Department of Homeland Security. But considering the rampant threats and global terrorist attacks, these acts would have eventually been passed. As for economic consequences, these can be felt to this very day. Starting off, $55 billion wouldn't have been lost on the day 9/11 happened. Of that, $24 billion was the expected income of the lives lost. $8 billion was the World Trade buildings themselves, and computers, furniture, and cars cost $6 billion. Another $6 billion would go to utilities and subways, $5 billion for injury treatments, and finally $5 billion in other building damage. But that is just the immediate cost that would have been avoided. The stock market was closed till September 17, 2001, and when it reopened, the Dow promptly fell 7.13%. Fortunately though, this would recover by October. Furthermore, the airline industry wouldn't have lost $5 billion, of which $1.4 billion came from the 4-day shutdown and $3.6 billion came from the reduced air travel over the following year. And of course, war is by no means cheap, and this led to a sharp increase in debt. Over the years, the US would end up spending $2.5 trillion on the war on terror. $1.649 trillion directly went into war funding, with $867 billion in expected veterans care. This, along with the $589 billion used by Homeland Security and the economic and physical damage toll, would come out to a total of $3.3 trillion. In our alternate timeline, only the cost of Homeland Security would have still eventually came to be. But even then, it would have been much cheaper, as it would have been a gradual increase in spending rather than a sudden frantic increase where money was definitely spent ineffectively. In the end, experts estimate that 9/11 increased in national debt by at least $2 trillion. So without 9/11, the US debt would be $19 trillion or less, meaning that it would be less than our current national gross domestic product. It's not all bad though. The increased US spending created hundreds of thousands of jobs. Today, the TSA alone has 51,000 employees, with the Department of Homeland Security having more than 240,000 employees. So at least 300,000 jobs wouldn't have been created till much later, if ever. As a result, without 9/11, the US debt would be trillions lower, but the GDP may not be as high either without these jobs. Next, the most important effect, the repercussions on the American people. First of all, 2,996 people wouldn't have unnecessarily lost their lives, and over 6,000 people wouldn't have sustained injuries. There wouldn't have been nationwide fear in riding planes for several months, and we wouldn't see nearly as much fear and hatred towards Islamic people. Thousands of families wouldn't have been separated as family members headed to war in the Middle East. And that's just the effect inside America. Things were no better for American soldiers overseas. Nearly 7,000 US troops would be killed in Iraq and Afghanistan. While aggressive war was the best way the US could cope with the atrocities committed by certain people in these countries, it is worth mentioning that 200,000 civilians in Iraq, 38,000 in Afghanistan, and 23,000 in Pakistan wouldn't have died either. Furthermore, America's crackdown on immigration and deportations after 9/11 simply wouldn't have happened. According to ABC News, deportations doubled from 2001 to 2012, with criminal deportations increasing by 400%. And that brings me into the global changes in the world without 9/11. Of course, there's international airport security. The implementation of TSA across the US has set the global standard for airport security. But other than that, we saw the Arab Spring. This was a series of anti-government protests, uprisings, and armed rebellions that became rampant across North Africa and the Middle East in early 2010. While the overthrowing of such oppressive regimes is inevitable, this probably would have been delayed for several more years. For instance, the year Osama bin Laden was killed by the US in Pakistan, 3 brutal Middle Eastern dictatorships were also removed, 2 by unarmed civil resistance tactics and 1 by NATO-assisted armed rebellion. Without the overthrowing of Iraq and the global war on terror, people in these countries wouldn't have gained the confidence to rebel this early. On top of that, China may very well not be as big as it is today. Looking back at the early 2000s, relations with China were at the very least not peachy. Remember in April of 2001 when a US spy plane collided with the Chinese fighter jet in the South China Sea, which led to 12 days of tense standoff between the two countries? While monumental at the time, these conflicts were quickly forgotten amid the tragedy of 9/11. But in our parallel universe, Chinese conflicts would have remained just as tense, and we may have never seen the rise of China as a superpower, which has resulted in a sort of economic Cold War today. The Great Chinese Firewall may have not grown to block basically every American website, and we may have not seen trade wars escalate to all-time highs. Finally, without 9/11, the Islamic State group wouldn't have grown to become nearly as big. Sure, without 9/11, their leader Osama bin Laden may have not been killed, thus leading to more terrorist attacks. But despite the loss of their leader, the 9/11 attacks showed extremists that they were capable of causing unforgettable terror to even the strongest country in the world. And this alone is more motivating for extremists than one person like Osama bin Laden ever could be. There is no denying that terrorism has been exponentially growing ever since 2001, growing from under 2,000 attacks in 2001 to over 15,000 attacks in 2014. Fortunately, however, these attacks peaked in 2014 and we have been on a decline since. But without a quote, massively successful attack for Al-Qaeda, the reach of the group wouldn't have grown so rapidly, causing even more worldwide disaster. Overall, 9/11 has touched everyone's life around the world in one way or another, from having to deal with more acts of terrorism like the 2008 Taj Hotel attack and the 2016 Bastille Day attack in France, to smaller acts that are just as significant. It has also introduced simple, everyday, inconvenient but necessary security measures like increased airport security. But more importantly, it has united the globe on a scale never before seen to combat terrorism. From the valiant efforts of the passengers on United Airlines Flight 93 preventing a crash into the White House, to the thousands of soldiers risking their lives every day for the well-being of mankind as a whole. And the thing is, as I said in the beginning, even if 9/11 was prevented, the terrorists would have continued trying over and over again. But maybe, just maybe, after preventing 9/11, we could have stopped them before they were able to succeed with anything on such a grand scale. Unfortunately though, we can't change what has happened already, and as a result, while 9/11 is a tragedy that didn't need to occur, I believe that it has made us all much stronger moving forward. But that's just what I think. What do you guys think? And before you comment anything, let me just say, I know this video wouldn't have been made if 9/11 didn't happen. But anyways, if you guys like this video, then make sure to drop a like and consider subscribing if you'd like to see more videos just like this one. But until then, I'm Hari, and I'll see you guys on the next one.